They said an empty train can't move on its own, but that was before Shadow started barking at the fog. It was 5:42 a.m. outside Ashburn Rail Yard in Northern Virginia, and the world looked like it had been washed clean overnight, left dripping in a cold silver haze that clung to every rail line and steel beam like it didn't want to let go. Sergeant Caleb Morgan stood just beyond the chain-link fence with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, exhaling slowly into the morning air that carried the faint smell of wet iron and old diesel. Beside him, Shadow, a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 with sable fur and alert amber eyes, was completely still at first, but stillness was never his silence. It was his listening. Caleb had worked with dogs long enough to know the difference. Something out there had already reached Shadow before it reached him. The radio on Caleb's shoulder gave a soft burst of static, then died again, as if the air itself was swallowing signals. He tapped it twice, then gave up, eyes narrowing toward the yard ahead where rows of abandoned freight cars sat like forgotten giants frozen mid-memory. No scheduled activity, no known maintenance, just silence stretching too far in every direction. Then Shadow moved. Not forward like a normal patrol step, but sideways first, then forward again, nose low, pulling with a quiet insistence that made Caleb adjust his stance. "Easy," Caleb murmured, though his voice carried more curiosity than command. Shadow didn't respond the way he usually did to tone or discipline. His focus was locked ahead on something Caleb couldn't yet see, something buried in the way the fog bent around a specific stretch of track near the far end of the yard. The wind shifted, dragging a metallic whisper through the rail lines, a sound like metal remembering motion it hadn't made in years. Caleb frowned. There shouldn't have been any operational equipment in that section. The records had marked it inactive for over a decade. Still, Shadow pulled harder now, muscles tense under his coat, his gait shifting from controlled walk to urgent lead. Caleb followed, boots crunching softly on gravel mixed with frost, each step sounding too loud in the unnatural quiet. The further they moved from the road, the more the world seemed to detach itself from normal rhythm, as if time had slowed just for this stretch of yard. A distant horn echoed once, low and hollow, but Caleb knew there were no trains scheduled in this sector. None at all. He glanced down at Shadow again, noticing how the dog's ears were pinned forward, locked onto a point straight ahead where the fog thickened into a pale wall. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to break the tension building in his chest. Shadow responded by stopping abruptly, planting his paws near the edge of an old maintenance track that branched off into rusted siding rails. He didn't bark. Not yet. Instead, he stared, unblinking, as if waiting for something to acknowledge them first. Caleb followed his line of sight and felt it then, a subtle wrongness in the air, like the yard had shifted slightly off alignment with reality. The tracks ahead curved into fog, disappearing too cleanly, too perfectly, as if erased rather than obscured. Shadow let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something restrained and deliberate, the kind of sound he only made when instinct outweighed instruction. Caleb stepped closer, boots stopping just short of the rail. The metal beneath his feet was colder than expected, almost unnaturally so, and for a moment he considered calling it in, reporting a false signal or environmental anomaly. But Shadow took one step forward, then another, and the pull in his leash wasn't forceful now. It was certain. Like he had already made a decision Caleb hadn't been told yet. The fog ahead shifted again, just slightly, revealing the faint outline of something massive standing still in the yard where nothing was supposed to be. Caleb narrowed his eyes, trying to focus through the haze, and that's when he realized it wasn't just the shape of a train car. It was a full locomotive, intact, silent, and impossibly present on a line that had been officially decommissioned for years. Shadow stopped at the edge of the fog, body rigid, tail still, eyes locked forward as if recognizing something Caleb had not yet been allowed to understand. The air felt heavier there, not dangerous, but loaded with the weight of something unfinished. Caleb tightened his grip on the leash, heart slowing into a measured caution as he studied the outline ahead. No lights, no crew markings, no sound of engines cooling or systems running. Just a train that should not exist in a place that should have been empty. Shadow finally barked once, sharp and clear, breaking the silence like a signal rather than a warning, and stepped forward into the fog as if whatever waited beyond it had already been waiting for him. The moment Shadow stepped into the fog, Caleb Morgan felt the world narrow into something smaller, tighter, as if the entire rail yard had drawn a slow breath and decided not to release it. The German shepherd did not hesitate, did not look back, did not wait for permission. He simply moved forward with a certainty that made Caleb follow instinctively rather than logically. The fog swallowed Shadow's outline within 3 steps, his silhouette dissolving into a pale blur between steel tracks and forgotten gravel. Caleb tightened his grip on the leash, but it was already loose, more symbolic than functional, because Shadow was no longer pulling him, he was guiding him. The air grew colder as they crossed the maintenance line, a temperature drop so subtle it felt psychological at first, like walking into a memory instead of a place. Caleb scanned the surroundings again, trying to anchor himself in facts. Abandoned rail yard, decommissioned freight line, no scheduled activity, no personnel clearance. Yet every fact felt increasingly irrelevant the deeper they went. Then, through the shifting mist, a shape began to form again ahead of them, not moving this time, but waiting. The locomotive stood on the tracks like it had been placed there by something that did not care about documentation or timetables, its surface dulled by age, its edges softened by years of exposure, yet strangely intact in a way that made Caleb's instincts uneasy rather than relieved. Shadow slowed as they approached, each step deliberate now, as if confirming details only he could detect. Caleb whispered, almost unconsciously, "This makes no sense," but the words disappeared into the fog without resistance. There were no lights inside the train, no glow from control panels, no sound of engines or cooling metal, just silence so complete it felt constructed. Shadow reached the front side of the first car and stopped, head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring as he traced something along the base of the metal stairs. Caleb followed, eyes narrowing, noticing faint markings on the side of the train that looked partially scraped away, as if identification had been intentionally removed or never fully applied. He stepped closer, boots scraping lightly against the rail ties, and placed a hand on the cold metal surface. It was colder than it should have been, not just from the morning air, but something deeper, like it had been sitting untouched for longer than it should have been possible. Shadow suddenly shifted position, moving along the side of the car with increasing urgency, stopping near what looked like a sealed cargo door halfway down the first compartment. He placed one paw against it, then another, scratching once, not aggressively, but insistently, as if confirming presence beyond it. Caleb leaned in, listening, but there was nothing, no voices, no movement, no mechanical hum, only the faint pressure of silence that made sound itself feel distant. He raised his radio again out of habit, pressing the transmit button, but static answered him in a broken pulse before fading out completely. Still nothing, he muttered, lowering it again, more to himself than to Shadow. The German shepherd gave a low, steady sound now, different from earlier, not alarm, not warning, but recognition, as if he had arrived somewhere he was not expecting but somehow already knew. Caleb studied the sealed door, noticing scratches near the locking mechanism, subtle but recent enough to break the illusion of abandonment. His training told him to call for backup, to mark the position, to avoid engaging alone with unknown infrastructure, but something about Shadow's behavior contradicted caution with certainty. The dog was not afraid. That alone made Caleb more alert than any broken signal or abandoned train ever could. He stepped closer to the door, placing his hand near the latch without touching it yet, and in that moment, the fog around them seemed to thin just slightly, revealing more of the train's length disappearing into the yard like a corridor without end. Shadow pressed his head lightly against Caleb's leg, not seeking comfort, but confirmation, as if asking whether he was ready to understand what came next. Caleb exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the seam of the sealed compartment, and for the first time since entering the yard, he realized the silence was not empty at all, it was waiting. Caleb Morgan kept his hand near the sealed cargo door, feeling the cold vibration of metal through his glove as if the structure itself was holding its breath. Shadow stood perfectly still beside him now, no longer pulling or circling, just watching the seam where the door met the frame with an intensity that made Caleb's skin tighten. The fog around them shifted in slow waves, thinning just enough to reveal more of the train's length stretching backward into the gray emptiness of the rail yard, as if it had no beginning and no end, only presence. Caleb listened carefully, expecting something mechanical, maybe settling metal or wind slipping through gaps, but there was nothing except the quiet pressure of stillness. He raised his radio again out of habit, pressing the transmit button once more, but the response was only a broken pulse of static that faded into silence. "Whatever is inside this thing," he muttered under his breath, "it is blocking every signal in a 300-foot radius." Shadow reacted immediately to his voice, not by moving, but by shifting his focus slightly downward toward the base of the door, where faint scratches marked the metal near the locking seam. Caleb crouched slowly, bringing his eyes level with the markings, noticing now that they were not random, but deliberate impressions, as if something had been tested against this door repeatedly. He traced the edge of the seam with his fingers, feeling no external lock mechanism, only a recessed panel that looked recently disturbed. Behind him, Shadow let out a soft, controlled sound, the kind he made when confirming something familiar rather than discovering something new. Caleb exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment he considered stepping back, reporting in, and waiting for a full team to arrive, but the yard felt wrong in a way that made waiting feel more uncertain than acting. He pressed gently against the panel, and to his surprise, it shifted slightly, not opening, but acknowledging pressure like a system that had been waiting for activation. A faint mechanical click echoed from inside the structure, distant but unmistakable, causing Caleb to freeze completely. Shadow did not move, but his ears tilted forward in perfect alignment with the sound, as if tracking its source through layers of metal. Caleb leaned in closer, placing his ear near the seam, and for a brief moment he thought he heard something beyond the structure, not a voice, not a clear signal, but a rhythmic pattern, almost like a system cycling on standby after years of dormancy. He stepped back again, eyes scanning the length of the train, noticing now that several of the other cars had identical sealed doors, each marked by the same lack of identification, each identical in condition, as if they were part of a controlled design rather than abandoned equipment. Shadow moved suddenly along the side of the car, stopping at a point where the metal paneling showed subtle discoloration, a faint difference in tone that suggested hidden reinforcement beneath the surface. He scratched once, then twice, then stopped, waiting. Caleb followed, kneeling again, running his hand along the surface, and this time he felt it too, a faint warmth hidden beneath the cold exterior, inconsistent with the surrounding air. "That is not possible," he said quietly, though his voice carried less disbelief than concern. The fog shifted again, revealing for a second the outline of a small access marking partially obscured by rust and time, suggesting a secondary entry point that had been deliberately concealed. Caleb's instincts sharpened, his training telling him this was no longer a simple abandoned structure, but something that had been intentionally maintained. In secrecy, Shadow pressed his head against the metal again, closing his eyes for a brief moment, as if listening to something Caleb could not hear. Then, without warning, a soft internal sound echoed through the train, not loud, not threatening, but unmistakably active, like something deep within the structure had responded to their presence. Caleb stepped back immediately, scanning the fog around them, expecting movement or confirmation from outside, but the rail yard remained empty and still. The realization settled in slowly, heavier than before, that they were not the first to arrive here, and whatever was inside the train had not been left behind. It had been waiting. Caleb Morgan stepped back from the sealed cargo door as the faint internal sound faded into the steel body of the train, leaving behind a silence that now felt more intentional than natural. Shadow remained fixed in place, his posture low and focused, eyes locked on the exact point where Caleb had just felt that subtle vibration, as if the dog was tracking something still moving behind the metal skin of the structure. The fog around them thickened again in slow rolling sheets, briefly swallowing the lower half of the train before revealing it once more, like the yard itself was breathing in uneven cycles. Caleb adjusted his stance, scanning the length of the rail yard beyond the locomotive, searching for any sign of external activity, But the emptiness only reinforced the feeling that whatever was happening was contained entirely within this place. He raised his radio once more, this time holding the transmit button longer, but the only response was a distorted burst of static that cut off abruptly, leaving complete silence in its place. Still nothing, he said under his breath, though now it felt less like a report and more like confirmation of isolation. Shadow suddenly moved again, not forward this time, but along the side of the car, pacing slowly until he reached a point just beneath a faded panel seam where the metal plating showed uneven alignment. He stopped there, pressed his nose against the surface, and exhaled sharply, as if recognizing something that confirmed a memory rather than a threat. Caleb followed closely, crouching again, now noticing that the seam was not just misaligned but deliberately structured, almost like a secondary layer had been added after the original construction. He ran his fingers along it carefully and felt a faint shift beneath the outer shell, a hidden separation that suggested an internal compartment running parallel to the main freight section. This was not part of standard rail design, Caleb muttered, his voice low and steady, though tension had begun to settle in his shoulders. Shadow responded with a single short bark, not loud, but precise, and immediately stepped back 2 paces as if creating space for Caleb to understand without interference. Caleb stood slowly, eyes narrowing, and glanced once more at the fog behind them, half expecting movement or reinforcement, but the yard remained unchanged, frozen in that unnatural stillness. Then it happened again, a second internal sound, slightly clearer this time, like a system engaging after long dormancy, followed by a faint shift in pressure that seemed to pass through the entire length of the train. Caleb turned toward the sealed door instinctively, watching as a barely visible seam of light flickered for less than a second along its edge, then disappeared. Shadow's ears snapped forward instantly, body tensing, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the train had just answered a question only he had been asking. Caleb approached the door again, more cautiously now, placing both hands near the frame but not touching, feeling a subtle warmth that had not been present before, inconsistent with the cold metal environment around them. Something inside this system is active, he said quietly, more to himself than to Shadow, as his mind began to process possibilities that did not belong in an abandoned rail yard. The fog shifted again, and for a brief moment the outline of the entire locomotive became clearer, revealing uniform compartments spaced with deliberate precision, far too organized for a forgotten structure. Shadow began pacing slowly now along the base of the train, stopping every few steps to listen, then continuing, as if mapping something invisible beneath the surface. Caleb followed his movement, realizing that the dog was not reacting randomly, but tracing a pattern, a sequence of responses coming from within the train itself. A third internal sound echoed, longer this time, followed by a faint mechanical resonance that vibrated through the rails beneath their feet. Caleb felt it in his boots, a subtle but undeniable shift in energy that suggested the structure was transitioning from dormancy into controlled operation. He stepped back immediately, raising his radio again, but this time did not attempt transmission, instead observing the behavior of the device as its indicator light flickered weakly before stabilizing. Shadow returned to his side now, pressing close, not seeking direction, but alignment, as if both of them were now witnessing the same unfolding process from different forms of understanding. Caleb looked once more at the sealed door, the fog thinning just enough to reveal that the panel seam had widened slightly, not fully open, but no longer fully closed. And in that narrow gap, something moved inside the darkness, not violently, not suddenly, but with the quiet precision of something that had finally acknowledged it was no longer alone. Caleb Morgan kept his eyes fixed on the narrow seam of the cargo door as it shifted again, just enough for the change to be undeniable, the metal no longer behaving like a sealed structure, but like something responding from within. The faint movement behind the gap was subtle, almost hesitant, like an internal system testing whether the outside world was still present. Shadow stood completely still now, his entire body aligned toward that same seam, ears forward, muscles tight but controlled, as if he had entered a state of absolute focus where nothing else in the yard existed. Caleb took a slow step closer, careful not to disturb the balance of whatever process had begun, and felt the air around the train shift again, not colder or warmer, but denser, like pressure building in a closed space. The fog outside the rail line began to thin in uneven patches, revealing more of the locomotive's length, and for the first time Caleb noticed that every car shared the same structural pattern, identical spacing between seams, identical sealed access points, all designed with precision that did not match abandonment. He lowered his voice instinctively, though there was no one else to hear. "This is not just a freight train," he said quietly, more as a realization than a statement. Shadow responded by stepping forward one pace, placing his paw near the base of the partially opened seam, then pausing again as if confirming that Caleb was ready to see what came next. A soft internal click echoed through the metal frame, followed by a faint mechanical hum that seemed to travel along the length of the train rather than originate from a single point. Caleb felt it in his chest more than in his ears, a subtle vibration that suggested systems reactivating in sequence. He stepped back immediately, scanning the yard again, expecting some external trigger or secondary presence. But the environment remained empty, the fog still, the rail yard silent except for what was now clearly coming from inside the structure itself. Shadow let out a low, controlled sound, not alarm, not excitement, but recognition, and began to move along the side of the car again, stopping at intervals where faint seams and hidden panels marked the exterior. Caleb followed closely, noticing now that each point Shadow stopped at corresponded with a subtle internal response, a faint pulse or shift that echoed through the metal in delayed synchronization. It was not random. It was coordinated. The realization settled into Caleb's thoughts slowly, that whatever was inside the train was not passive cargo or abandoned machinery, but an integrated system responding to proximity and presence. He reached out again toward the nearest seam, this time pressing more firmly, and the panel gave a fraction more, revealing a thin line of darkness behind it that had depth beyond the exterior shell. The air that escaped from the gap was different, not stale, not fresh, but controlled, as if preserved. Shadow immediately leaned closer, sniffing the opening with increased intensity, then stepped back again as another internal tone resonated through the structure, longer and more stable than before. Caleb stepped away from the door and looked down the length of the train once more, noticing now that faint lines of alignment markings ran along multiple cars, suggesting modular sections that could activate independently. "This was never meant to be idle," he whispered, his voice steady but increasingly focused. The fog parted again in slow motion, revealing the far end of the train where another seam of light flickered briefly, as if a second compartment had just acknowledged the same condition. Shadow moved back toward Caleb and stood beside him now instead of ahead, positioning himself slightly behind the line of the opening, as if adjusting to a shift in understanding rather than action. Caleb glanced at him and saw something unusual in the dog's expression, not confusion or alertness, but certainty, as if Shadow had recognized the system long before Caleb had begun to interpret it. Another internal pulse traveled through the train, stronger this time, causing a faint resonance along the rails beneath their feet. Caleb felt it clearly now, a structured sequence rather than random activity, like a network coming online step by step. The seam in front of them widened another fraction, not enough to reveal everything, but enough for Caleb to see that beyond the metal door there was organized space, not storage, but containment with purpose. He exhaled slowly, keeping his movements minimal, understanding now that any sudden action could alter whatever process was unfolding. Shadow remained still, eyes locked on the opening, waiting not for command, but for confirmation that Caleb was witnessing the same truth. And in that shared silence, the train continued to wake. Caleb Morgan stood motionless for a moment as the train continued its subtle internal awakening, the faint rhythmic pulses now spreading through multiple cars like a controlled sequence rather than isolated events. The seam in front of him remained partially open, just enough to suggest depth beyond the metal shell, yet still refusing full disclosure, as if the structure itself was deciding the pace of revelation. Shadow had shifted closer again, but this time he was no longer pressing forward, instead standing slightly to Caleb's side, angled toward the opening with a posture that suggested awareness rather than urgency. Caleb noticed the change in the dog immediately, The way Shadow's focus had transitioned from searching to observing, as if the unknown had already been identified and was now being assessed rather than discovered. Another internal tone echoed through the train, longer and more stable than before, followed by a faint alignment vibration that traveled along the rails beneath them in a clean, measured pattern. Caleb crouched slightly, placing his hand near the seam again, but this time he did not apply pressure. He simply observed how the gap reacted, widening imperceptibly in response to the internal cycle. "It is responding to presence," he said quietly, the realization forming fully now rather than as speculation. The fog around the yard thinned once more, revealing additional sections of the locomotive stretching further than he had initially estimated, each car identical in structure, each sealed with the same precision, suggesting a system designed for synchronization rather than transport. Shadow took one step forward, then stopped again, this time not at a seam or panel, but at a point where the metal surface showed faint circular impressions, as if something had been mounted or monitored from within. Caleb followed, scanning the markings, recognizing now that these were not random wear patterns but intentional contact points, possibly sensors or interface nodes embedded within the structure. The air grew subtly warmer near these points, a detail that did not match environmental conditions, and Caleb felt a growing certainty that the train was not abandoned at all, but maintained remotely or internally in a dormant operational state. A new sound emerged then, softer than the previous pulses, almost like a calibration sequence passing through the system. Shadow reacted instantly, not with alarm, but with stillness, his body aligning perfectly with the source direction, as if tracking a signal only he could interpret. Caleb's attention returned to the partially opened seam, where the gap had widened just enough to reveal a thin vertical slice of darkness beyond the exterior wall. He leaned closer carefully, adjusting his angle to avoid triggering any abrupt mechanical response, and for the first time, he noticed faint structural layering inside the opening, multiple internal surfaces rather than a single compartment. The design suggested depth, controlled segmentation, and containment zones arranged with deliberate engineering precision. "This is not a freight configuration," Caleb murmured again, now more certain than before. Shadow moved slowly along the side of the car once more, stopping near a second seam further down the train where a similar faint internal vibration responded almost immediately to his proximity. The synchronization between Shadow's movement and the train's internal response became increasingly apparent, as if the dog's position was interacting with a distributed system embedded within the entire structure. Caleb followed, feeling the ground beneath the rails transmit another faint vibration, stronger now, more consistent, like multiple internal systems aligning into a unified state. The fog briefly parted again, revealing the train's far end where another faint light flickered within a separate compartment, not external illumination, but internal activation. Caleb paused, realizing that the entire locomotive was transitioning through a staged sequence, each section responding independently yet coherently, like a network reawakening after prolonged inactivity. Shadow stopped again and turned slightly toward Caleb, holding eye contact for a brief moment, not seeking instruction but confirming shared awareness. Caleb understood then that whatever this train contained was not simply being observed from the outside. It was also observing them in return through systems already online within its structure. The seam in front of them widened another fraction, steady and controlled, and the darkness beyond it shifted subtly, suggesting that something inside had moved closer to the threshold without crossing it. Caleb exhaled slowly, maintaining stillness, fully aware now that the process unfolding was not random activation, but a deliberate sequence, responding to their presence with increasing precision. Caleb Morgan remained still as the train's internal rhythm continued to stabilize, the faint pulses now forming a steady sequence that moved through the structure with deliberate precision rather than uncertainty. The seam in front of him widened another fraction, enough now to reveal a thin line of dim interior light that did not resemble emergency illumination or standard freight lighting, but something softer and more controlled, like a system designed to guide rather than expose. Shadow stood beside him without tension, his posture balanced and alert, eyes fixed on the opening as if waiting for a moment he had already anticipated long before Caleb understood it himself. The fog around the rail yard shifted again in slow, uneven waves, but it no longer felt like an obstacle, more like a boundary gradually acknowledging what was emerging from within the train. Caleb leaned in slightly, careful not to trigger any sudden mechanical response, and noticed that the internal light was not static but gently pulsing in sync with the earlier vibrations, suggesting a centralized system regulating multiple compartments at once. A soft mechanical hum passed through the metal skin, smoother than before, almost like a stabilization phase rather than activation, and Caleb felt the structure transition from dormant to fully responsive awareness. He lowered his voice instinctively, though there was no reason to hide it. "This is not cargo," he said quietly, the realization settling more firmly now. Shadow moved forward one step, then paused directly at the threshold of the seam, his nose near the edge where the light spilled faintly into the fog, and he exhaled slowly, as if recognizing a scent that carried meaning rather than threat. Caleb followed his gaze and saw that inside the narrow opening there was not a storage compartment, but a structured interior corridor lined with uniform panels, each one marked with subtle indicators that flickered in slow coordinated intervals. The design was clean, clinical, and intentionally organized, suggesting purpose far beyond transportation. He reached out carefully, touching the edge of the opening, and felt no resistance, only a controlled response that allowed the gap to widen slightly more, revealing additional depth within the train. The interior lighting adjusted in real time, brightening gradually as if acknowledging presence rather than reacting to intrusion. Shadow suddenly stepped forward into the opening without hesitation, but instead of entering fully, he stopped at the threshold, standing with one paw inside and one still outside, as if confirming alignment between two spaces. Caleb followed closely, placing one foot into the opening and immediately noticing the temperature difference, not colder or warmer, but regulated, consistent, and artificial in origin. Inside, the corridor extended forward with symmetrical precision, walls lined with embedded panels that emitted soft pulses of light in a repeating sequence. Caleb scanned the environment, realizing that every section was connected, every signal synchronized, every movement of light part of a larger operational language. "This is a system," he said under his breath, no longer questioning it but acknowledging its structure. Shadow moved slowly along the interior edge, stopping at a panel where a faint circular indicator glowed brighter as he approached, then dimmed as he stepped back, confirming a direct responsiveness to proximity. Caleb observed closely, noting how each time Shadow shifted position, different sections of the corridor reacted with subtle changes in illumination patterns, as if the system was mapping presence rather than detecting intrusion. A soft chime echoed through the interior, not alarming but neutral, followed by a deeper stabilization hum that seemed to confirm full activation of internal processes. Caleb took another careful step inside, his eyes adjusting to the controlled lighting, and noticed that the corridor extended far deeper than the exterior dimensions suggested, implying a layered internal structure designed with expanded capacity beyond physical expectation. Shadow stopped again and turned his head slightly toward Caleb, holding still for a moment, then resumed forward movement at a slow measured pace, leading rather than reacting. Caleb followed, his attention shifting between the environment and the dog, realizing now that Shadow was not simply responding to the train, but interacting with it in a way that suggested prior familiarity or encoded recognition. The corridor lights responded in sequence to their movement, brightening gently ahead of them while dimming behind, maintaining equilibrium rather than exposure. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of understanding replace uncertainty, as the train no longer felt like an abandoned structure but a maintained system awaiting confirmation of identity. And as they moved deeper into the illuminated corridor, the synchronized pulses continued around them, steady and patient, as if the entire train had been waiting not to be discovered, but to be acknowledged. Caleb Morgan moved deeper into the illuminated corridor, each step producing no echo, as if the structure absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The synchronized lighting above them continued its slow coordinated pulse, guiding their movement forward with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost instructional, as though the system itself was acknowledging their presence and adjusting accordingly. Shadow walked ahead now without hesitation, no longer testing the environment, but moving through it with quiet certainty, his body language calm, yet fully engaged, as if every meter of this corridor was already mapped in his instincts. Caleb followed closely, eyes scanning the symmetrical walls that stretched in perfect alignment on both sides, each panel embedded with subtle light indicators that shifted in response to their passage. He noticed now that the deeper they went, the more structured the environment became, not like a transport vehicle, but like a controlled interior facility hidden within a moving frame. The air remained consistent, filtered, and neutral, without the dust or metallic dryness expected from an abandoned rail system, reinforcing the realization that this was actively maintained. Caleb spoke softly, more to confirm his own reasoning than to communicate outwardly. "This is not a train interior in any conventional sense," he said, his voice steady but low. Shadow paused briefly at a junction where the corridor expanded into a wider chamber, then turned slightly, waiting for Caleb to catch up before proceeding. The chamber ahead opened into a circular node-like space, with concentric lighting patterns embedded into the floor and walls, each layer pulsing in staggered timing like a living system distributing information across multiple points. Caleb stepped into the space carefully, immediately noticing how the lighting responded not just to movement, but to positioning, adjusting brightness in segments that corresponded directly to their location within the chamber. A faint tone resonated through the environment, deeper than before, not an alarm, but a confirmation signal that seemed to register their full entry into the system. Shadow stood at the center of the chamber now, head lowered slightly, eyes scanning the perimeter as if recognizing reference points only he could interpret. Caleb observed him closely, realizing that the dog's behavior was no longer exploratory but procedural, as though Shadow was interacting with a framework that predated their arrival. The central lighting pattern beneath them brightened gradually, revealing a faint circular interface embedded in the floor, divided into segments that illuminated in sequence as Shadow shifted his weight across them. Caleb knelt slightly, studying the pattern, and noticed that each illuminated segment corresponded to a distinct response from the surrounding walls, confirming that this chamber was a control node rather than a transit space. "This system is reacting to him," Caleb said quietly, his tone shifting from confusion to structured analysis. Shadow responded by stepping off the central circle, and immediately the lighting dimmed slightly, as if awaiting confirmation before continuing its sequence. The corridor behind them remained open, but the chamber ahead revealed multiple branching paths, each one marked with identical lighting signatures that pulsed in coordinated intervals. Caleb realized now that the structure was not only responsive but adaptive, reorganizing its internal signals based on their position and interaction. A deeper resonance passed through the floor, and the circular interface beneath them shifted its pattern, introducing a new sequence that had not been present moments before. Shadow turned his head toward Caleb briefly, then moved toward one of the branching paths without hesitation, as if selecting a direction already determined by internal logic. Caleb followed, feeling the environment subtly adjust around them, the lighting narrowing into a focused path that extended forward while dimming peripheral corridors. The sensation was no longer of discovery, but of progression, as if they had entered a system that was now guiding them toward a predetermined endpoint. Caleb exhaled slowly, maintaining awareness of every detail, understanding that the train was no longer a passive structure, but an active framework responding to recognition and sequence alignment. And as they moved deeper into the branching corridor, the synchronized lighting continued to pulse in steady rhythm, confirming that whatever lay ahead was not waiting to be found, but waiting to complete its activation. The branching corridor extended forward in a controlled narrowing path, the synchronized lighting guiding Caleb Morgan and Shadow deeper into the internal structure of the train with an almost procedural precision. Every step they took seemed to trigger a subtle response from the environment, the lights above them adjusting in soft cascading sequences that reinforced the sense that the system was no longer passive but actively engaged with their presence. Caleb maintained a steady pace behind Shadow, his attention divided between the dog's calm, purposeful movement and the increasingly complex architectural layout unfolding around them. The corridor walls on either side shifted from simple structural panels into layered surfaces embedded with faint circular nodes, each one pulsing in synchronized intervals that matched the rhythm they had observed earlier in the central chamber. The deeper they moved, the more the environment resembled a coordinated network rather than a linear passage, as if the train had expanded internally into a fully integrated operational system. Shadow suddenly slowed, then stopped at a junction where the corridor opened into a larger forward chamber, its entrance marked by a wide circular threshold of softly glowing light. He did not enter immediately, instead standing at the edge, head slightly lowered, as if listening to a frequency that existed beneath audible perception. Caleb approached cautiously, observing how the lighting within the chamber reacted to Shadow's presence first, then subtly adjusted when he stepped closer, confirming once again that the system prioritized proximity recognition over static programming. As they crossed into the chamber, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly, not in temperature or sound, but in structure, as if they had entered a higher level of operational control. The space was expansive, circular in design, with concentric layers of illuminated panels arranged in descending rings toward a central platform. Each ring pulsed in staggered timing, creating a visual rhythm that suggested data flow rather than simple lighting. Caleb stepped onto the outer ring, immediately noticing how the system responded to his position, brightening the path ahead while dimming areas behind them in a controlled gradient. Shadow moved directly toward the center without hesitation, and as he crossed each illuminated segment, the corresponding light patterns shifted in response, confirming that his movement was being tracked with precision. Caleb followed closely, his analytical focus intensifying as he realized that the chamber was not merely reactive but interpretive, adjusting its configuration based on their combined positioning. At the center of the chamber, a circular interface emerged beneath the lighting grid, composed of segmented panels that activated sequentially as Shadow stepped onto them. The activation sequence was smooth and deliberate, each segment lighting in a cascading pattern that extended outward toward the surrounding rings. Caleb knelt slightly, studying the interface as it responded directly to Shadow's stance, then shifted again when Caleb adjusted his position beside him. "This is not random activation," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady as he observed the consistent correlation between movement and system response. Shadow stood perfectly still at the center, his posture aligned with the geometric symmetry of the chamber, as if he had assumed a designated position within a larger operational framework. The lighting intensified slightly, and a new sequence began, this time radiating outward through all concentric rings simultaneously, suggesting a full system acknowledgement rather than partial engagement. Caleb felt the subtle vibration beneath the platform, a structured resonance that indicated internal synchronization across multiple layers of the train. He looked up, scanning the chamber's perimeter, noticing that previously inactive panels were now illuminated, revealing additional structural depth extending beyond the visible boundary of the space. Shadow turned his head slightly toward Caleb, maintaining stillness, as if confirming readiness for the next phase of interaction. The chamber responded again, introducing a deeper harmonic tone that traveled through the floor and walls in unified alignment, reinforcing the sense that the entire system had transitioned into a fully active state. Caleb exhaled slowly, his understanding now shifting from observation to recognition of a complete operational architecture functioning beneath the surface of what had appeared to be an abandoned train. And as they stood within the illuminated center, surrounded by synchronized patterns of light and resonance, the system continued its final sequence, confirming that their presence had not triggered discovery, but completion.